Hello, spooky friends. This week, we're finally getting into the creation of my historically accurate 1790s Bride of Frankenstein. Before we get too much into the creation of this costume, I wanted to make a quick aside. So, this particular costume is a historically inspired cosplay, and while I introduce it as historically accurate with the air quotes for the sake of quick explanation as to what the costume is, there are going to be elements of design that you wouldn't necessarily see in fashion plates and that sort of thing. So, no, it's not purely accurate. Like, I couldn't wear this to strict reenactment events, but as a costume, it's as close to authentic as I can get it, including only hand sewing every item. This design has taken me some time. I started working on it a year ago. The timeline of the film posed some interesting problems. So, the Bride of Frankenstein film was made in the 1930s and maybe meant to take place around 1899, judging by one of the tombstones, but with very anachronistic costumes. And there's a really weird flashback, or maybe a flash forward, with Mary, Percy, and Byron from around 1818, which made for a really weird mishmash that I had to put back into the 1790s without making the ensemble look like a monster. The 1790s are already not everyone's favorite period of dress. It's hardly what most people think of for designing a Gothic sort of costume, especially in 18th century Gothic. And even when I first started, I toyed with the idea of making maybe a black and white sack gown that would go with huge electrified hair rather than working off the actual year that Victor creates the female creature, which is probably 1796, 1797. And that idea just didn't feel right in the end, though. I couldn't really get into it. And then I realized that the shapeless white dress that the bride wears looked like it would translate really well into the unstructured, high-waisted round gowns of the 1790s, especially if I could add an open robe over it, which would imitate the sort of tent-like structure that Pretorius and Victor, or Henry, I guess, throw over the bride in a way that would make sense for that time period. And the round gown is so called because it closes all the way around in front rather than including a separate robe and petticoat all the time. It appears to me to have evolved from the chemise gown, popularized by Marie Antoinette in 1783. White was a really common color, and same with pastels. These were not the only options, though. Most surviving museum examples are made in lightweight cotton, but you can find some examples in silk, which is what I opted to work with. Many fashion plates show open robes over the round gowns to dress them up and give them a little bit of extra color. These vary in styles, but mostly they have some kind of closure in front. A completely open robe isn't a very common style for the decade that I chose, but there are a few extant examples. So I dug up a couple of examples of completely open robes with no closures over round gowns in this decade. I based my initial design off of a 1796 silk wedding gown and its reproduction by Sarah Woodyard at Colonial Williamsburg. It is an amalgamation of styles between 1789 to 96, which makes it really confusing to analyze, but it's kind of perfect for a character famously made from multiple parts. I chose this because it fit the lines of the bride's dress in the film really well. I also looked at a 1797 cashmere gown made from 2 block printed shawls, which also has the open robe style, and I liked its use of color and undersleeves, which I thought had been more of an early Regency or late Regency thing rather than early. And I finally also found the 1798 round gown with an open robe and embroidered trim, which heavily influenced the final look of the robe. In making a round gown or chemise style gown, there must be some kind of structure underneath the floating materials. This is usually an underbodice made out of linen and fitted with the back of the fashion fabric. It then allows the front of the gown to be light and ethereal. The pattern I used for my base was the round gown from the American Duchess Guide to 18th Century Dressmaking, with a couple of adjustments like the fall front opening. I broke strict accuracy by picking a silk blend that was very lightweight. Silk duchesse or satin, especially this much, was a little bit out of my budget, and I actually really don't like the way gathered taffeta looks. It reminds me too much of crumpled paper, which I didn't want on the front of the gown and therefore most visible. But natural fiber blends wouldn't have been impossible at the time, and this is very close to the way such a blend behaves. I designed this with a bib front opening to hide the underbodice. Bib front gowns are closer to the Regency era, but there are some 1790s examples, such as this painting, that appear to portray them. It seemed like a good way to do the front closure on this silk gown, since stomachers and other false fronts had generally fallen out of fashion. The 1796 reproduction wedding gown actually does use a false front as a sort of stomacher, but the researchers of that particular gown weren't especially impressed with it, and this wasn't something I wanted to replicate exactly. I started with the bodice by hemming a ribbon onto either side to close off the raw edges in a crisp way and give just a little more structure to the very lightweight drapey material. For the skirt, I used 2 panels of silk seamed at the sides. Each panel has a tiny false seam every 18 inches. Silk at this time would have been woven much thinner, between 18 to 24 inches and no wider, which makes 54-inch wide silk a bit inaccurate. But I didn't want to cut the silk into panels and make more effort for myself. Hence the false seam, which I sewed with a running back stitch. Seamed at the top of the skirt front is the bodice front, which is held up with white hooks and worked eyes. The waist seam on my gown ended up not being quite as low as in the painting, but it is still not directly under the bust, hitting roughly mid-rib cage in the transitional style. Seamed at the top of the skirt front is the bodice front, which is held up with white hooks and worked eyes. The waist seam on my gown ended up not being quite as low as in the painting, but it is still not directly under the bust, hitting roughly mid-rib cage in the transitional style. Alright friends, here's a warning against hubris and making the mistakes I have made. If you're going to embroider a gown, do it way ahead of your deadline or do it by machine, and that's perfectly valid. Initially, I hadn't planned on doing any embellishment for this gown, intending on having the accessories and robe be all the decoration it needed. I also wanted this gown to remain plain so that I could wear it with other haberdashery, accessories, or robes, which would extend its use beyond just the Bride of Frankenstein. But the longer I looked at examples, the more I noticed embroidery and trim near the hems of these white round gowns. And because I have zero chill, I decided to try my hand at doing something fairly neutral to dress it up. Then I began to study the gown Elsa Lanchester wears in the beginning of The Bride of Frankenstein as Mary Shelley. This fairy tale net gown took 12 weeks to finish, adding one more strain on an already very troubled film production. While the exact pattern is difficult to see in the film, I found a still of the dress that shows huge sequined butterflies. Elsa Lanchester also noted that there were moons and stars among the design. I thought it might be fun to pay homage to both her roles in the film with my embroidery, so I went with these three motifs, which are actually not commonly found on extant garments. I found a couple of butterflies on some waistcoats, but no celestial symbols. Patterns of the 18th century were drawn out by designers and sold or lent out to professional and amateur embroiderers alike. The patterns were pinned or basted to the fabric stretched in a frame, and the embroiderer would stitch the design onto the fabric. I decided to try embroidering like this, but with a slightly altered technique. I pinned my paper pattern under the silk and traced the pattern that way. This is because I was being a little bit inaccurate and stitching the fabric after the skirt of the dress was complete, which meant I needed an embroidery hoop to keep my fabric taut. I also don't own a huge frame like they would have had. First, I couched a strand of silver pearl thread along the scalloped line. For the leaves, the silver is a DMC Light Effects thread worked in a backstitch. Metallic floss is not my favorite thread, and I felt like it was a little bit harsh on my delicate fabric, but it has a fantastic effect overall. I just had to be very careful as I worked. Then I satin stitched the butterflies, moons, and stars in a corresponding warm gray cotton thread. Silk thread would have been more accurate, but this is what I had on hand at the time when I began this. It didn't take me 12 weeks, but it did take me 60 hours over 10 weeks. Obviously, this would have been faster if I had worked full days and if I hadn't gotten sick. Still, I am very pleased with the result, and as we will see, I did not learn my lesson about embroidering. But let's talk a little bit about the open robe first. The most common type is just a round gown without the front panel of the skirt and the bodice attached. The open robe seems to have evolved from gowns of previous decades, like Saxe and Italian gowns descended from the Mantua gown, where one garment hangs open over the other. However, where those showed off the petticoat, the Regency-era open robe goes over a complete round gown. This trend doesn't stick around for very long, but it's a bit of a staple of the 1790s as seen in fashion plates. The changes to the open front had some interesting fit challenges with the shoulder straps. I had to make sure it was taut enough to prevent any waviness in the hem of the stiff taffeta, but not so much that it pulled funny. The open robe seems to have evolved from gowns of previous decades, like Saxe and Italian gowns descended from the Mantua gown, where one garment hangs open over the other. However, where those showed off the petticoat, the Regency-era open robe goes over a complete round gown. This trend doesn't stick around for very long, but it's a bit of a staple of the 1790s as seen in fashion plates. Open robes could be made in a different color over a white gown. They could be white on white, trimmed or embroidered, and elaborate or plain. Most of the ones I've seen had pretty decent trains, which trailed behind the wearer or could be slung up over the arm to keep it off the ground. And here is where I decided to embroider some more. Somehow I just wasn't done. I wanted some reference to the character's origins in horror that would have been lost in more accurate florals. So the embroidery for this gown deviates from what is strictly historical, but is closely based on extant embroidery. The 1798 white gown uses delicate crewel work to give it a little pop of color along the hems. By the time I stumbled on this work, I was in roughly my third iteration of designing the embroidery, and just could not make myself be pleased with it. Lightning and skulls are not a very common element in historical clothing, so every design I tried to make looked off. However, when I saw this embroidery, it gave me an idea for blending historical accuracy with the motifs I wanted. I used the scalloped line of the design and replaced the pattern with wide sutures because Frankenstein. The leaves became thin streaks of lightning, alternating in the peaks of the scallops. From a distance, it's pretty similar, and not entirely out of place at most events, but up close, it's unmistakably suited to Frankenstein imagery. So, when the skirt and back were done, but not the shoulder straps or sleeves, I traced out the pattern onto the taffeta and embroidered in silk thread with a tiny chain stitch all the way down. This, like the round gown, took a while. It was a total of 42 hours. The pattern was simpler than the butterflies and moons, but the length of the gown from shoulder strap to shoulder strap around the train is 207 inches. So, yeah, it took a hot minute. I decided to put more color into the robe than was strictly necessary for this usually all-white cosplay. When I looked at fashion plates, there were a lot of color pops and bright accessories in those white gowns, as well as trim and embroidery. They weren't completely austere until about 1800. Also, I like thinking of history as more than just black and white or sepia toned. People in this decade loved ensembles with a splash of color, so I trimmed this whole robe in green-black iridescent taffeta, colors which are very much associated with our Frankenstein monsters. I made my own bias tape out of a half-yard section of that taffeta, and I sewed the pieces together by hand, with a quick running backstitch. I didn't need to do this by hand, but at this point, I wanted to do as much of the ensemble as I could by hand. This thin bias tape trims the hem of the robe, breaking the stark white with a little period-accurate color pop. Historically, binding tape would have been cut on the straight of grain, rather than on the bias as I am doing, but I knew I was going to need a lot, and I used the entire half-yard section to do it, so the historical issue of wasted fabric wasn't relevant here. With that, the main part of the robe is finished. There is, however, one more detail to add: the undersleeves. This is something you see in early 19th century gowns more than late 18th century, but there are some examples from around 1797 to 1799. These were designed to be removable, basted into the edge of the shorter sleeve for day wear and pulled out for evening wear. I thought this might be an interesting way to interpret the bandages wrapped around the Bride of Frankenstein's arms while not restricting mobility. Linen historically was also used as the material for a burial shroud, which is quite appropriate. However, due to Acts of Parliament in 1667, linen was replaced with wool as burial shrouds in England until 1814 in an effort to support the wool industry and limit the import of French linen. Still, I stuck with linen because, while the dress reference is English, the areas where much of Frankenstein takes place are continental, like Geneva and Ingolstadt, and not restricted by these English laws. My initial attempt at an undersleeve from Patterns of Fashion was a little bit bulky. The actress had her bandages obviously wrapped around her bare arms, almost to the point of immobility, and mine were very obviously pinned to a sleeve. So I tightened up the sleeves a little, and then stitched the linen bandages in place. And then I could breathe a sigh of relief and swear off embroidering a gown forever. It took me over 100 hours in total to hand embroider the entire thing. And while I love it, that is not something I want to repeat anytime soon.